Hello everyone. Welcome to Voice of Russia for you. I'm very glad to see you here and hope that you are glad to see me here as well on your screens. Guys, first of all, I suggest that you make yourself some tea or coffee, sit back and listen to my another story. Well, today I'm going to tell you about the rock music in the Soviet Union, or to be more correct, about absence of rock music in the Soviet Union and about how rock music came to the Soviet Union. So guys, I think I should start out with telling you that back in the day in the Soviet Union, there wasn't such a thing as rock groups. We didn't know we didn't know that there was such a thing as a rock group. In the Soviet Union, we had so-called vocal instrumental assembly. The abbreviation went like VIA, that stood for vocal instrumental assembly. In fact, they looked like the Western rock groups, as I understand it now, because they normally had rhythm guitar, solo guitar, bass guitar, drums. Sometimes they used some electric piano, but I must admit that they didn't use any sort of distortions for their guitars. So maybe there were some. Maybe I'm a little bit mistaken, but in most cases their sound was absolutely clean. And those I'll be calling them groups, okay? So those groups used to play lyric songs. They used to sing about love, about pure love, first of all, about love to the party, about love to the family, about love to the country. And of course, their texts were checked thoroughly before each song was released. There was so-called special state art committee that would check each song before it was released. And of course, if this committee found something that conflicted with the ideology of the Communist Party and so forth, the musicians were asked to change the words. Or if they were unable to change the words, such a song might be prohibited. So, as I believe, a lot of songs were just killed, and people were unable to listen to those songs because this committee didn't allow these songs to be released. But nevertheless, some songs were released, and in fact, those songs they had a pretty high quality, I would say, because the musicians which played in these groups, they were professionals. I want to mention that it was impossible to play in a vocal instrumental assembly if you didn't have a professional musical education. So you were supposed to be graduated from some musical school or institute in order to play in such groups. So this music was of a rather high quality, it's true. But what this music was lacking is, this, I think, inspiration. I think it was lacking real, true expression. So it didn't have this zest in itself. That's why it was of a rather high quality, but at the same time rather boring. And also I want to say, I forgot to tell you about it before, I forgot to tell you about it right away. Each group was supposed to be part of so-called Philharmonie Society. Philharmonie Society was an organization which had affiliates all over the big country, so-called regional affiliates, regional branches. And the musicians should be assigned to a certain regional Philharmonie Society. And why? This Philharmonie Society allowed those musicians to play professionally. In other words, this membership allowed them to get money for their work. So otherwise, they weren't allowed to get money for their performance. And if they did so, it was considered an unlawful activity. And of course, some groups did so, but those groups were considered prohibited. Of course, there was some sort of corruption, and some people could find some ways of this evasion of the responsibility, but in general it was prohibited. So now I want to move slightly from the story about these vocal instrumental assemblies about real rock groups that still existed in the Soviet Union. Of course, there weren't many of them. You know, to be honest, I think I won't be able to remember even quite a few of them, but I can tell you that I think the most prominent rock group that could be, I think, officially called, I mean, not officially, fairly called a rock group, was the group that was called in Russian Mashina Времени. And in English it stands for time machine. You know, maybe I'm mistaken, I'm not sure, but it seems to me that they weren't assigned to the Philharmonia Society. It seems to me that they were independent, but they were, by the Soviet people, they were considered not part of those vocal instrumental assemblies I just told you about, but it stood a little bit apart as an independent, more informal group. You know, in fact, they didn't sing anything that somehow conflicted with the ideology, with official ideology of our country. I think that's why they were not actually prohibited. You know, there were some rumors that their activity wasn't maybe approved by our officials, but nevertheless, actually, you know, nobody touched them seriously. So, and even now, those people who used to play in this group, their leaders like to mention that they were prohibited, but in fact they were not. But they like to mention it. Maybe they gain some additional points doing so. I don't know. So I don't know. Maybe I'm mistaken, but this is probably the only group I can remember. It's the only group that comes to my mind thinking of these independent rock groups. But when the perestroika had begun in the 1985 when Gorbachev came to power. You know, we started seeing a lot of relief in the policy of our government, and new rock groups started to pop up here and there. And it was the time when we, for the first time, met the heavy metal groups. And of course, we started to listen to the Western rock groups' records. You know, the groups that, the names of the groups that come to my mind are the Accept, the Manowar, Iron Maiden, of course, AC/DC, and many others. And during this time, our Soviet rock group started to pop up, and I think the two most prominent, I think the first rock groups that we met were called Aria and Черный Coffee. That stands for black coffee. So Aria and Black Coffee. It were the first two heavy metal rock groups. And I want to say that they were real professionals. But, you know, guys, at the same time, some tape cassettes started to come into our country. In some ways, we started to listen to this music. Of course, we became interested in this music. And at the same time, we wanted to become more familiar with the musicians. We wanted to know more about those people who played this music. And there was no information about it. But it turned out that there was one source of such information. Some of my friends, one of my friends told me that on BBC, on the Russian service of the BBC, was a program that was called something, I'm not sure, but it went like rock review or rock music review, something like this. And this program was run by the Russian immigrant whose name was Seva Novgorodtsev. So this Seva Novgorodtsev, a long time ago, he used to play saxophone in some jazz band, and he was born, if I'm not mistaken, in the St. Petersburg, former Leningrad. And during one of their foreign tours, he left in the UK, and he got the job with the BBC, and he started to run his own program, which was called Rock Music Review. So this Seva Novgorodtsev ran his program each Friday at midnight. So it was the night between Friday and Saturday. And so, very few of us had this radio receivers, but there was one in my family. So each Friday I switched on my radio receiver and listened to this half-an-hour program. In this program, Seva Novgorodtsev was telling us different stories about the rock groups. He told us about the names of the musicians. He told us about the history of these groups. He told us about significant facts in the history of these groups. And you know, sometimes he ran some series of stories. For example, one series was dedicated to, let's say, AC/DC. So and several Fridays, maybe for example for 5 Fridays, we listen to the story about AC/DC, and next 5 Fridays we listen to the story about other rock groups. Of course, it was fascinating. He was very, he was very hilarious man. His programs were very bright. He was very funny. He made some jokes, but of course he played music, which we loved so much. So his stories were interrupted by some musics, so by some songs he switched on for us. He played for us, and his his program started with a very funny song. As I found out later, he recorded this song himself by adding different voices. In fact, it was only his voice. It was only his voice, but he recorded his voice in different tones, from a rather low to rather high, and it sounded like a female choir, like a Russian female choir, and it sounded like Seva Seva Novgorodtsev, Город London BBC. So that stands for Seva Seva Novgorodtsev, City of London, BBC. And after that, there was some intro, if I'm not mistaken, by the accept, like, and so forth. And after that, he started his stories and he started playing the music. So of course it was fantastic for us, because it was probably the only source of this information we had. And nevertheless, this source was very feeble, because these programs were jammed. They were heavily jammed, and it was the quality in fact was shit, but it was so interesting that it didn't matter, in fact. So we would listen to these stories again and again. And since for example, among my friends, I was the only one who had this radio receiver, and when sometimes my friends came over to my place and we would listen together to these programs, but sometimes I listened to the stories alone, and I recorded these programs onto my tape recorder, and after that I played back these programs to my friends. So we would gather around and listen to the stories recorded on the tape cassette. We were so much excited about all this that it's very difficult to express, and I think it's very difficult to understand how happy we were. Well, and the period of time I'm telling you about is between, I believe, 1985 and 1981, when the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, there were a lot of the liberalization, I'm sorry. And the Western rock groups started to come to the Soviet Union, and I remember I was at one of the concerts where were a lot of popular rock groups. There were Scorpions, there were uh, probably Iron Maiden, Accept, and many other groups. And honestly, it was very difficult to believe our eyes, because just a couple of years ago, before the time when we became able to watch these groups live, it seemed to us like something impossible. It was so strictly prohibited that we couldn't expect that we'd be able to see those groups alive. And we were so happy about it that it's impossible to express, and it's possible to explain. So I think probably I've told you everything that is worth something. Of course, probably I've forgotten something, but it's impossible not to forget anything. And if you remember, I mentioned the two rock groups, Aria and Black Coffee. Guys, these groups were fantastic. Of course, many say that they were copying popular Western rock groups. Probably they really were, but I don't think it's a big problem, because every as I see it, every musician, every poet, anybody, any artist is inspired by someone. And of course, uh, those who inspired an artist, of course, they influence his or her art. So I think it's not a problem that, for example, Aria sounded like, maybe it's true, in some way like Iron Maiden, but nevertheless, I think that Black Coffee was more unique, probably. And guys, I want you to listen to a couple of songs of these rock groups. I'll try to embed these videos in my video, but if it's impossible, if I'm not able to do so, but I hope I am, please look it up on your YouTube. I'll put description. I'll put the names of the groups and the links below my video. So guys, I hope my story was interesting for you. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great time and see you next time. Bye bye bye.